I guess we can get started. Thank you all very much for being here today. This is a good crowd. And I want to thank the Academy of Aspect, which is the Academy of Senior Professionals at Eckerd College, which is where we are today. And especially I want to thank Betty Dolinsky and Ann Rasko and Jim Sweeney, who sort of put together the exhibition that precipitated this talk today. So I'm very glad to be here. I think we might be able to just get started. And what I'm going to do is talk quite a bit about my early inspiration before I get into the actual artwork, to give you an idea of everything that sort of fed into my early inspiration, everything that still figures and plays a big role in the work that I do as an illustrator. So we're going to spend time talking about all of that. And some of those influences are here, and they include my family and childhood, nature and the environment, religion, and specifically Catholicism. I was raised a Catholic, not practicing now, but that did go to 9 years of Catholic grammar school. The ideas of perception, illusion, and reality. Music, how that figured in, and especially 1970s progressive rock, which I'll tell you what that is. Psychology and the unconscious mind. And I'm specifically using unconscious as opposed to subconscious, but basically the same thing. And then finally, art history and surrealism in particular. And I am a surrealist. That's normally when people meet me for the first time and ask what I do, I say I'm an artist. And then the next question is, well, what do you do? And I say that I'm a painter. And then the next question is, well, what do you paint? Portraits or landscapes or still life? And I say, no, I'm a surrealist. And that sort of usually a blank stare. So then I explain to them what surrealism is. And there's a couple of good, well, Max Ernst, who was a very well-known surrealist artist, put it very well. He said, surrealism is a linking of two realities that by all appearances have nothing to link them in a setting that by all appearances does not fit them. So, and then his compatriot, Salvador Dali, who had a huge influence on me, developed what he called his paranoid critical method. And he said that method is a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectivity of the associations and interpretations of delirious phenomena, which is a typical, it's a very typical Dalinian statement of doublespeak. What he's trying to say is that he uses his unconscious as an inspiration for all that, or much of his subject matter. And the unconscious, Jung would refer to it as the shadow self, all those things about ourselves that we prefer not to look at, that are frightening to us, our dark sides. So for Dali, that was a huge influence for him, and for me too in a lot of ways. I grew up in Peekskill, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley, and there's my little house on Lyman Avenue. And I'm showing you this aerial view because right across the street, okay, I'll just point to it. Right across the street, here's our house. Right across the street was this undeveloped, probably 3 acres or so of land. And being right across the street, I spent a lot of time in there, exploring, watching nature through the full cycle of the year, all 4 seasons. Then there was this larger area that might as well have been a deep, dark forest, which it kind of was, but I can't tell you how much time I spent in the woods just observing and watching nature do its thing through the seasons, and that really had a huge influence on me from a very, very early age. This is the earliest existing work of art by me. As you can see, my mother made a note kind of explaining it. Stephen drew this horse, 3 years old, 1965, and she pointed out that it has 5 legs. So,
surreal.
Very surreal, and probably the fact that she sort of praised or singled out the fact that this was not a traditional depiction of a horse, I'm sure that I took that as a compliment and as a way to get attention. So that was a very influential piece of mine that I still have. Another big influence was Highlights magazine, and we had a subscription that would come once a month, and this was before I could read, so when that would come, I would immediately turn to the page that had the picture search puzzles. And there would be a list of all the objects that you would need to find in this picture, which I couldn't read. So I was never aware if I had found them all or not, but it was great fun looking for them all. And actually, since I've done this slide, I've actually found a couple more that I missed the first time. So, but again, that idea of what you see, there's more to what you see than what you're looking at. So, and if you spend time looking at it long enough, you begin to see other things. I love that idea. I went off to it was called the Assumption School. It was the Catholic school in town from kindergarten through 8th grade. Got a great education. The whole idea of surrealism and the world being a very surreal place hit home on day one when I went to kindergarten. Parents brought their kids, dropped them off in the classroom, and back then you couldn't stay. The parents had to leave. So as soon as the door closed, the nun who was teaching our class reached into her chop drawer and pulled out a clear glass vial filled with red liquid. And she said, if I catch any of you lying, this is acid, and I'm going to put a drop of this on your tongue. So you would think that going to a nice, loving, secure school like that you would be safe and it would just be an extension of the home. Well, that changed in an instant. So from then on, I was very skeptical about the nature of reality and the outside world. Also, the Christian church, art historically, so much of our Western art that we appreciate, the Christian church has been responsible for it. So that in itself, Okay.
I thought I did that.
Thanks, Jim. So managed to get through 9 years of school there. Like I said, it was great education. I learned a lot in many different ways. There was a little library in the school, and one of the books that I took out countless times was Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, and was actually published the year I was born. And if you don't know the story, it's about a little boy who gets sent to his room, and you never see him out of this fox costume that he's wearing. So he's, all through the story, he's half boy, half fox. And he gets in his boat and goes to this island of the wild things and winds up taming them. They become friends. They hate to see him go when he gets back in his boat to go home. And when he gets home, everything is back to normal. But Jung would sort of see this book as what he called the individuation process of sort of confronting your demons, taming them, befriending them, and becoming a whole human being. Not that I knew that while I was reading it at the time, but it was one of my favorites. Another book I loved was Perplexing Puzzles and Tantalizing Teasers, which I still have in my library. And it was just filled with optical illusions. The one in the middle has to do with perspective and how it can play with your perception of distance. Next to that is the sort of endless staircase. I think Roger Penrose was sort of responsible for that. I could never get enough of this book. I have to mention Mad Magazine, which was banned from my house, but we managed to get our hands on it anyway. And again, the inside back cover was always this page that you would fold in on itself, and when it's unfolded, it's one image. As soon as you fold it in, it becomes a different image. So another instance of that sort of double imagery that fascinated me so much. Later on in high school, I became aware of M.C. Escher's work. He was a Dutch graphic designer or graphic artist. And this is very typical of most of the work that he did. Again, optical illusions. There's that endless staircase again at the top with monks continuously going up and down at the same time, never getting anywhere. He was a big influence. This is a set of nature encyclopedias that I still own. Again, spent hours and hours and hours pouring through these. This was back when printed photography wasn't what it is today, so it was better to reproduce illustrations. You could have more control over the images that way. So they were filled with pages and pages of illustrations of all aspects of nature. And so for me to see all of that rendered artistically and realistically was really fascinating. Now we get to the music part, and I owned all of these albums. These are the album covers of records I had in my collection, most of them being that progressive rock that I mentioned. And progressive rock came about at a time when the concept album was popular. And what that was the album had a beginning and an end, and you were meant to listen to each of the songs in sequence. There was a story to be told. It was very surreal. The artwork on the cover sort of illustrated the music you were listening to, so it was a whole experience. And a lot of these artists had a great influence on me. There's Roger Dean up in the upper left, and Giger next to him. But again, I would just stare at these album covers, look at the artwork, listen to the music. And I was in high school. I would fantasize about one day maybe doing the artwork for an album cover, which did happen later on. At the end of high school, I was invited to illustrate the cover of the yearbook. From what they told me at the time, this was the first time it had ever been done. Normally, high schools just had a sort of standard cover that they would put on their books, and so this was kind of groundbreaking. Not quite an album cover, but close enough. And I was voted most artistic in my high school class. So graduated from high school, went off to the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. My intention was to study graphic design. One of my professors, seeing my drawing ability, talked me into going into illustration instead. What I should have done was been in the painting department. By the third year, the illustration department was just, the assignments were just too rigid. You were given an assignment, you were supposed to satisfy that assignment, not think outside the box. So I was getting very, very frustrated in that department. And by the time I wanted to switch into painting, it was too late. The administration wouldn't let me do it. Luckily, the school had a European honors program where they selected 30 students to spend the year in Rome. And I applied to that and got accepted. So my final year of college was spent studying in Rome independently. There was no curriculum as long as you just kept working and kept producing. So that's really where my painting career started, and was just a great exposure to all the great art of Europe and what was there in the museums in Italy, which I had never seen. I grew up in a family. I'm the only artist. My parents were very good with their hands. My mother made a lot of her own clothes. My father repaired everything that needed to be repaired in the house. 3 older brothers, they went on to do other things. So that exposure that year in Rome was really mind-blowing for me. So I came home, graduated, moved to Soho in New York City with a little portfolio. This was one of the paintings, all the same size, that fit neatly into this portfolio. And my plan was to find a gallery in Soho and start my painting career. And this was in the day, believe it or not, where you could walk into a gallery, ask to see the director of the gallery, and they would let you in. And that just would never happen today. I got a lot of good responses to my work, but none of the galleries reached out and agreed to represent me. So as I was running out of money, I knew I had to get a job, and I fell back on my degree, my illustration degree, and got a job with an agency that represented commercial illustrators. Not as an illustrator, I was their sales representative. So I would dress in a suit every day, and with portfolios under my arms, would visit art directors and creative directors at all of the major ad agencies and publishing houses and magazines in New York City. But I had a plan. And they were one of the oldest and most respected agencies in New York, and they had some pretty high-powered illustrators under their wings. One of them was Gervasio Gallardo. He was a Spanish illustrator and fine artist, lived in Barcelona, probably their highest paid illustrator, but I watched him turn down job after job that came through because there wasn't enough money. And there was no one else in their stable of artists that could be offered as a backup. So I thought, let me copy his style, and maybe I can start to get some of those jobs for myself. So the image on the left is one that I did specifically as a sample for that purpose, and it worked. On the right is one of his that he did. There was an ongoing Grand Marnier campaign, magazine ads. And Celestial Seasonings was one of the other companies that wanted to use him, but they couldn't offer what he was asking. So I wound up doing a lot of those. I did, I think, 8 total boxes, Celestial Seasonings boxes, and there's 3 of them there. Not exactly the same style, but close enough for a lot of the clients who wanted to use him. Another artist I made samples in the style of was Salvador Dali. This was 1993. This was before Photoshop was even invented. So if you wanted an image like this, you either had to hire an illustrator to paint it or find a photographer who could make that in the darkroom, basically. And there was a lot of work out there, clients needing this style. So this was a poster for Microsoft, and you can see the smaller details on the sides are little details from Dali's paintings, and you can see where I stole aspects of his paintings. The crutch is in there, which is a recurrent image in a lot of his work. Instead of a soft watch, I've got a soft mouse. I turned his flaming giraffe into a flaming television, and peeking inside the cranium of the guy on the left, I used that. A couple more magazine illustrations with obvious references to Dali's work. There's another one. Now, I want to point out the bird, the hummingbird in this one, because this was around the time when birds started to enter into my work almost without my knowledge. I wasn't aware of it until about 10 years later when I looked back over everything I had done, and birds kept reappearing. So this was one of the first instances of that. This one's called Rosancello. Here is another illustration for a CD cover by a band called Heart with more Dali references. Another bird, right? Another CD cover. And this one actually came before the other. So this was that time when I realized my dream, my high school dream of finally doing an album cover for a rock band. It was a dream job. They gave me the lyrics to all of the music that was in the album, but not the music. And they said, just use the lyrics to come up with imagery to illustrate them. So I was really left on my own to just do whatever I wanted to do. There's more bird references. If you look at the palm tree, there's a hidden bird there. So, and it looks kind of like Florida, doesn't it? And that's one thing I want you to keep in mind as we eventually get to the fine art is there's going to be a whole projection of change in color, change in tone. So this is kind of where I start out, and then it changes over time. I wanted to give you a glimpse into my painting process, how I actually create all this work. And I'm using this one. It's called The Fracture from 2006. It's, I think, the only painting I ever documented all the way through as I was working on it. And on the left is an old antique photograph I used for the model, which I do very often. Below that is a photo I took myself. And what I've always done, and this began when I was working as an illustrator, when time was a factor, you couldn't waste a minute. I trace. Don't tell anybody, but I trace all the time. So I trace all the elements that are going to be in my paintings. I scan them into the computer. In a drawing program, I can move them all around to create my composition, which is the middle image. I print that out, put the printed image in an opaque projector, which is on the right, and literally project it onto my canvas or whatever it is I'm going to be working on, and again trace that onto before I'm ready to start the painting. So that whole process goes very quickly. This is the first step. I'll just read each of these. Step number 1, you stretch the linen over wooden stretcher bars or canvas, unless I'm working on a wooden panel. Then I prime that with white gesso, 4 or 5 coats, letting them dry and sanding them in between until I get the right surface that I'm after. Then I project my drawing onto that surface and trace it again. Then I apply what's called an imprimatura, which is it's a way of toning the white canvas to sort of not make that so stark. And I usually use a sort of a warm gray and just lightly brush over that surface so that I can still see the drawing underneath, but I'm not working from a white surface. Once that's done, I'm ready to start the underpainting, which is the first layer of paint. And here you can see more clearly the imprimatura underneath. If you look at the flowers, that sort of gray washy color underneath with the pencil drawing on top of that. And then that is the first layer of paint that I start to apply. After that, I start adding successive layers of paint, and sort of filling in the details little by little. A little more adding of detail and working out the tones and the colors. And that just keeps happening, keeps happening layer after layer until I finally get to a point where I'm satisfied with the way everything's looking. Here we're almost done. And finally the finished painting where I'm satisfied with the amount of detail, the color, the tonality. But that gives you an idea of what I go through. So now we're going to go year by year up to the present. And so I'll talk briefly about each of these. I won't go into a lot of detail. I may just point out a couple of things about each one. But this was one of the very first paintings I did. It was actually in that transition period between still illustrating and creating paintings at night for myself that were more, in my mind, paintings than illustrations. So this was one of those first ones. Again, birds make an appearance. I really had no narrative in mind for these, at least in the beginning. This one's called Pink Condor from the next year, 1993. And you'll notice how small they are, 13 inches by 9.5. Again, before the advent of computers, I was literally tracing the images, and I had to find images that were compatible size-wise to make the composition without being able to rescale them in a computer. Flora, number 1, this was a series of 4 or 5 altogether that I did. The hummingbird is back. And this one was heavily influenced by, or my whole career, the Dutch and Flemish painters from the 1500s and into the 1600s had a huge influence on me. I was living in New York City at this time, and we'd go to the Met very often, and I was always fascinated by Hans Memling's portrait of Marie Portinari, and if you look at her necklace and what she's wearing, it's exactly the same. Stolen directly from her. Then I moved to Virginia. My ex-wife and I at the time moved to the Blue Ridge Mountains, a huge shift from the city life to being in a very, very rural area. And it gave me the chance to go back and get re-involved and reacquainted with nature again. I had kind of gotten away from that in New York, but where we were living, I joined the local environmental league and got very interested in just the environment all over again. So these show it. This is called Acorn King. And we have Tree Lady. I should say my titles are very simple. They're not terribly descriptive. I don't want the title to tell you what you're supposed to be thinking or seeing, so I try to keep them as simple as possible. This is maybe the first one where the figure is literally rooted into the landscape, and that starts to happen more and more.
You're working larger now, too.
Yes, that's a good point. I think I'm not sure if I was using a computer yet or not, but I might have been. Walnut shell helmet from the next year. Notice too that even though I was getting very involved in the environment and nature again, a lot of these paintings will have very desolate backgrounds, and that was a symbol of my emotional state at the time and actually sort of a prolonged depression that I was in for about 5 or 6 years. And that was beginning to reflect itself. Again, the tone, the color is starting to go down. They're darkening. Another bird. Next year, this one's called Insect Crown. my wife at the time had been very involved in fashion, so that was a lot on my mind. So I was making a lot of costumes out of elements found in nature, leaves, tree bark, insects. Again, very dark, very introspective. From the same year, this one's called Bird Lady. She is standing in a large nest. She's holding a bird in her hands there, and there's broken eggshells in front of her, and she's got a pair of wings tied to her head. This was probably one of the most popular paintings I've ever painted. If I could have painted 10 of these, I could have sold them all. Again, very costume-oriented, an obvious reference to the Dutch linen ruffs that were worn. In this case, turned into a tree ring. And her dress is slowly being sort of pecked away by the woodpeckers there. Oh, and I should say, this was, when I moved to Virginia, part of the plan was to leave illustration behind, which I did, and focus more on my fine art. So when I moved to Virginia, it didn't take long before I did find a gallery in Washington, D.C., not too far from the house. Worked out very well. This was part of my first solo show there. It sold before the opening even began. The gallery was one of the oldest and best known in D.C. It was a wonderful relationship. That went on for a couple of years, and then each of the partners died within a year of each other. No, I'm sorry, a month. So there were attempts to keep the gallery going, but it just couldn't happen, so it closed.
Are those words written on the?
No, that's
It looks like letters to me. but-
no words, just the pattern by the holes.
Okay.
Year later, this one's called The Crane. Another very dark painting with a little glimmer of hope. There's that egg at the top, sort of indicating future potential. This one is called Seed Saver from 2001. The idea being that she's entering this sort of barren landscape, but bringing seeds with her in the hope of planting them later on, preserving whatever crop, in this case, corn. This one's called The Prodigy. This one disturbed a lot of people. I thought it would never sell, but it finally did. The idea being that we, in an effort to help ourselves, we can oftentimes cause a lot of destruction in the process. So thus the tree trunks and the tree stumps there, but this little girl is very hopeful about her future. This one is called The Wish. He's got very old hands, so young and old. He's holding a wishbone that he's about to snap. Metamorphosis. This one is called The Scaffold. Another instance where I used an antique black and white photograph for the portrait portion, and then just imagined and created all the rest to fill in around it. This one is called The Glade. In this case, I wanted the figure to almost blend in completely to the landscape. You know, if you were in this forest or whatever walking, you may just step right over her without seeing it. I wanted her to be so integrated into the environment and the landscape that she was just completely comfortable. This one is called The Yellow Ribbon. Bright and cheery, but aside from that, there's not much happiness here. She's again in the sort of desert landscape. The only water in sight is tied to her head, which she can't really reach. self-portrait as Rooster Warrior. Very fierce looking, but actually a chicken.
Formerly a dinosaur.
Right, formerly a dinosaur. This one is called the Eir, H-E-I-R, from 2005. We have this little royal person there with a lightning storm in the background. Little does he know, his scepter is a lightning rod. So he's looking a little uncertain about his future. The Wing from 2005. This one, the idea of flight representing freedom coming at a very painful price. And that's, I was using myself as a model very often during this time too. This one is called The Wheel from 2006. Again, a very dark painting, but in the background is that very roughly, sort of amateurishly, childishly painted blue backdrop put there in an attempt to cheer up the situation, but not doing a very good job. And you'll notice that one of the strings, there's 4 hummingbirds, there's one string that's broken, so one of them has actually managed to get away. Otherwise, he's dressed in a very constricting outfit there. This one is called Rika, or if you speak Danish, Hege. And birds start to take on, for me, they're sort of the agents of action in a lot of these paintings. You'll see the figures are very subdued, stationary, immobile, but the birds are the ones that are doing what's necessary. In this case, almost sort of alleviating burdens in a way. And in this case, I made them white. I didn't want to identify them as any particular species of bird. I just wanted bird. So by taking out the color, you're sort of removing the identifying aspects. 5 Roses from 2007. She might be clinging on to old memories, possibly. And that is a woman. That's another thing about a lot of the figures I use. There's a sort of androgynous quality. You're not sure if they're men or women. This one is called The Gift. That tension between gravity and weightlessness. To do her hair, I actually took a paper bag and twisted it into that shape to give me the sense of the spiral and the gesture of the hair. The Collar from 2008. You'll notice the bird in shadow in the back is not tethered to her collar. So in each of these, there's some little glimmer of hope, if you look for it. This one's called The Woodsman's Wife. And you'll see more in this sort of wife series. This was one of the first ones, possibly the first one. And the idea here is that she was half birch tree, was rooted to the ground, took her husband's axe, theoretically, and very painfully cut herself free, but gained her freedom in the process. This one is called Winterlude from 2009. This was a second version of one I did earlier, but basically the same painting. The first one was called The Stole. So when you think of a stole, it's a dead whatever, fox, mink. But in this case, it's living. They're entwined. They're working together, and the fox has a dead rat or mouse hanging from its mouth, and it's hard to see, but there's a couple of drops of blood on the snow. This one's called Ghost of Tomorrow, probably the darkest painting I've ever done. And not much to say about it. But it was right before a big change, which was during this whole dark period, quote unquote, of my life. Both my parents died a year apart from each other. My mother had Alzheimer's. I got divorced. All these things happened one after another. So it was a pretty rough period. Then I met my high school sweetheart, reconnected with her after 30 years. And we got back together. We're married now. And I moved in with her, and sex was on my mind. This one's called Animal Attraction from 2010. And I was looking at this today, and I had forgotten there were birds up in the tree. And then it's hard to see, but those branches down in the front, there's actually slugs mating. Hanging down there. And color starts to come back, and whimsy. This was one of the first paintings I did during that period, and just started having fun again, painting, and not caring so much about the subject matter and that sort of thing. Again, another wife painting, Beekeeper's Wife. This one's called The Decoy, and yeah, I was just having fun. I was trying to insert humor. She is very self-possessed, very in tune with the natural aspect of the painting. The bird is comfortable with her. And then there's this hand coming in from the side with this cutout bird trying to just, get her attention, and she won't have anything to do with it. I started also playing around. This one's called The Surrender from 2012. I really wanted to start loosening up. I'd been working so tightly for so long that I wanted to bring impressionistic brushwork and color and almost flirting with abstraction too, without entirely losing the tight realism that I love, but trying to combine them both into a single painting to see if that would work. And I'm really happy with this, but in doing these, and I did 4 or 5, I realized that to change my style and start working in another style, it doesn't happen overnight. And if I was going to do that well, I'd have to spend another 30 years to be able to do that as well as I can do realism and surrealism. So it was a good experiment. It taught me a lot, but I didn't stick with it. My wife and I were living in New York. We moved to Florida. This was the first painting I did after we got here. And if you think back to the Journey album cover on the beach, there's a lot of similarities, actually. And this is, all of my work is a self-portrait in a way. But this one literally is. It's sort of me coming from the north, completely not dressed for the occasion, finding myself in a strange new world and trying to make sense of it. This is also the largest painting I've ever done, 72 inches. It's 6 by 5 feet. This one's called The Gate. The first of a series of paintings, I started finding, again, antique photographs of children and started working them in to the paintings. In this particular one, you're not sure if she's entering this enclosed space or leaving. She just dropped the bolt cutters there on the ground, and she's got the chain and the lock in her hand. To paint that chain link fence, incredibly difficult. Especially to get the perspective right on the open gate. I can't tell you how much time I spent on that. And it's actually stenciled on there, or I worked it out on the computer, printed it out, cut a stencil for all the little lines, stenciled it on, and then went back and filled it all in. Took forever. The Lion Tamer's Daughter, another antique photo. She has stolen her father's whip and chair and left. You can see the big top in the background there, even taken some popcorn with her, and stolen the lion. So she's setting out on her own, and there's a little drawing above her on the cave wall there of a stick figure of a lion tamer. The gardener's daughter. Down in the lower left-hand corner, there's some paper dolls that she had cut out, but found her father's shears and thought it was her chance to go large. So took it upon herself to cut a giant doll shape out of the hedge, setting herself free in the process. Very proud of her work. This, the fan from last year, this was actually sold through Leslie Curran's gallery here in St. Pete, and was the first of a series of what I call my mermaid series. So my figures have left the land and gone into the sea, and I did 4 or 5 of underwater figures interacting with the wildlife there. This one's called The Beach from last year. I've always done, I don't have any examples here, but small paintings. They're about 7 inches square of birds. I call them my Royal Bird series, and they're just portraits of birds with rustic crowns on their heads, and I wanted to do a large version, so I picked a spoonbill and did him full length, and this is an example of the way I work more and more all the time. When I started this painting, I had no idea what else was going to be in the painting as far as the objects on the beach. I knew I wanted the spoonbill to have the cape and to be on a beach, but as I was working on it, these other objects sort of worked their way in. And so I like working that way these days. I'll always start a painting without knowing exactly what it's going to look like when it's done, which is completely the opposite of the way I used to work as an illustrator, where you had to know exactly what it was going to look like so that you could tell the client. And there's a little optical illusion in this one. That beach ball in the background should look larger than the coconut and the golden orb, but they're exactly the same size. Again, going back to that optical illusion of perspective and playing with that. This one's called the Pelican King from this year. These are just a lot of fun. These are just really fun to work on. Again, working from an antique photograph. Had to make some changes to his body. He was sitting in a chair. I had to move his arms and legs around to get him to work right, but slowly added everything else. This one's called the Ice Wings. She's half flamingo. Her wings are made of ice. They're either becoming ice or transitioning into the flamingo wings. We're not sure. Again, when I started this one, I didn't know what she was going to be holding in her hands. I added the ice skates, and the snow globe at the bottom was the last detail I put in there, and I wasn't sure what to have in the snow globe, and I finally decided on having a little ice skating figure pirouetting, so that went in at the very end when everything else was finished. Another one of the mermaid paintings. This one is called The Lure. I just love all those fishing lures. I don't fish, but they're just so colorful and shiny. I thought it would make a nice painting. She's she obviously lives in the water and has just turned these fishing lures into decoration jewelry. And this is the last painting I have. It's the last one I finished very recently. Another bride or wife painting. She I don't know. And that's one thing I have to say about surrealism and relying on the unconscious is that very often when people do ask me what my work is about or a particular painting, I have a hard time telling them because I am not sure. I have these urges to include elements in the paintings and may not know exactly why I do, but I know that it's right, so I'll include them. And sometimes many years later, looking back on a particular painting, it then will make sense to me, and I'll be able to connect the dots and understand why I made those decisions, but at the time I really wasn't aware of why I was doing certain things. So that's the end of the presentation, and if we can do questions, yeah, thank you.
Before the painting called The Gate, everything was very constricted and rather didn't make me smile. And you then began to have fun, and that was coming through.
Right.
There must be many in between that.
Right.
But that seems to be, she was breaking through. And then it began to be
Yeah, as I came out of that dark period of my work, there should have been, or you should start to see much more elements or aspects of symbols of freedom and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
There's no question, it's just a statement. So you're a wonderful painter.
Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Based on the way you do paint, when do you know a painting's finished?
I know when a painting is finished. It just tells me it's done. Since I don't know in advance what it's going to look like, I just get to a point where it's not asking for more. So once that last element goes in, then I pretty much know that I'm done, and I move on to the next one. And with me, I only work on one painting at a time. A lot of other painters will have several paintings going at once, but I just do one, start it, finish it, and then move on to the next one. And while I'm working on one, I might be thinking about the next one to come, but usually I finish one and I'm suddenly aware I don't have anything to do. So I get lost. Jim?
How many paintings do you get?
That's a good question because I counted once, and before the dark period, quote unquote, I was doing about 8 or 10. At my lowest, I was doing 16, so that my output went up, even though I wasn't very happy. So, is it true that artists have to suffer to? And it's going back down again too. The happier I get. Yeah. In the back.
Stephen, can you talk a little bit about the painting on the right? The bird?
The flame.
Yes.
That one is pretty straightforward. Again, I used an antique photograph for the face, and it's a woman. A lot of people think it's a man, but it's very much just a phoenix image.
When was that done?
That one. (2006). These are all 2006. I just realized. Yes.
Do you ever, I guess my question is, what is the advantage of stretching your own canvas and priming your own canvas? I mean, instead of just purchasing already stretched.
For me, you have a choice as to the thickness of the canvas. I like a very heavy, dense canvas or linen, and if you buy them from a store pre-stretched, you're basically stuck with a very thin. You don't have as much control over that. So, and like I said, manipulate the surface quite a bit to get it to where I want it to be. So even if I bought one pre-stretched, I would still add layer and layer of gesso on top of that to get it to where I want it to be. Yes?
do you keep some of
Oh,
your...
okay.
I'm
We'll
sorry.
start. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I wasn't here at the beginning, but it seemed to me I walked into the MFA and I saw those paintings on the wall.
There's 2 paintings of mine at the MFA in limbo. They did have them on display for a couple of weeks as part of when Anne read my bio in the beginning. I received the Muse Award from the St. Pete Arts Alliance. The museum hung 2 paintings as part of that. I probably shouldn't say anything, but they're still there at the museum. I may get them back, I may not. I don't know, but we'll see what happens. Yes?
Do you have favorites that you won't sell? Do you keep some of your own work?
Yeah, and in the beginning, I used to hold some and not offer them for sale because there was some sentimental value or attachment. These days, you can have whatever you want.
Before you go, you want to talk a little bit about your little book?
Yeah, I brought these along. These are a monograph that I printed. They're 10 or 11 years old now already, but if you'd like, these are for sale if you'd like to have one. I brought some copies with me, so they're just over here. You can talk to me at the end. Is there another question? Yes?
You still use music as an inspiration, and have your tastes changed there?
I still listen to a lot of the same. I still have all those now in CD form, but
Yeah, right there.
because it was such a creative time for me back then that there's a particular feeling and place I go to when I've listened to those things hundreds of times probably. And I never get tired of listening to a lot of that music that I listened to in high school.
Are you a musician?
Am I a musician? I technically I can say yes. On my 50th birthday, my wife bought me a violin because I'd always talked about wanting to play the violin. So I took lessons for a year. I need to get back to it, and that was back in New York. So technically, yes.
Yeah. Now, when I go into my studio, I turn music on. Do you?
I always have music playing, constantly.
It's hard to explain that connection, but there's a serendipitous relationship somehow. To me, it sounds to you.
Yeah, for me, having music going, I don't know, it just keeps me moving. I think if there's nothing to listen to, I tend to slow down, and so music keeps a tempo going for me. Yes?
Yes, you want to talk about products that you use. Is there any particular thing in oils that you use? I just had a real interesting thing talking to some different companies about oils, and oh wow. So, I have to make my own decision, but I'm interested in maybe a product that you use. Is it Sennelier? Is it Gamblin? Is it
My
Williamsburg?
painting
A whole bunch.
process is so simple because I never learned how to paint. I was in the illustration department at art school, and there was no emphasis on painting. There would have been if I was in the painting department, but so I had to teach myself. And what I've settled on, I primarily use Winsor Newton oil paint, but you need a medium to mix with it, especially if you're doing fine detail and that sort of thing. So Winsor Newton makes a product called Liquin, and it's just a clear, it's not quite a gel, it's thinner than that, but I mix that with my paint as I'm working. It helps speed the drying time, and that's all I do. I buy the cheapest, crappiest brushes. There's a lot of artists out there who think we need the best of everything, and you look at their work and it doesn't show up at all. So, sorry, all you. But
Varnish them?
yes, and then when they're dry, I varnish at least with one coat of gloss, picture varnish. Jim? Okay.
We have to stop if it's too soon.
How long,
Okay.
how long do you wait it to
I varnish very quickly.
Because of the liquid.
Well, that and I never paint very thickly. It's always very thin. You always hear wait 6 months. I wait about 6 days. So.
And then do you work daily from a certain amount of time to a certain amount of time?
No, my schedule is broken up all through the day. I'm constantly running errands, coming back, sitting down, painting for a little while, getting up, doing something else. A lot of artists need to carve out 4 or 5 hours at a time, but I'm able to get up and do different things. Okay, I think we have one more question.
You need input, for artistic brilliance that you have. And what I see is that as you go through your day and your evening, do you pull out books just from your library, or do you go on the internet, or where do you get your images that you may settle on?
I've got an fairly extensive art library that I always refer to, my cherished books. But the internet is such an amazing source now for, and especially details. I'm a docent at the Dali Museum here in town, and you can find images of those paintings online that you can actually get closer online than you can in the museum.
Well, let's thank him again for